truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Monday, March 4th, 2024, the 1139th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast on the day of its release. The only way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on a wide variety of podcast platforms. And of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. So the story of the day is the Supreme Court decision on ballot access in Colorado. But I do want to touch on a couple of things before we get to that. And the first is Nikki Haley's first fake primary win. Which state did she win, you might ask? Well, she didn't win a state. She won a foreign territory known as Washington, D.C. And of course, by won, we mean that she was declared the winner based on reported results that may or may not reflect the will of actual voters at all. This is from Reuters. Nikki Haley wins Washington, D.C. Republican primary in small symbolic boost. Presidential contender Nikki Haley won the Washington, D.C. primary on Sunday, her first victory in the nominating process, and a symbolic win for the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Edison Research said. Now, that is quite a strange attribution, is it not? Edison Research is who reports the outcomes of elections. Haley, the only remaining challenger to Donald Trump in the race, won 62.9% of the vote versus 33.2% captured by the former president. She still faces near impossible odds in her quest to win the Republican nomination to take on likely Democratic nominee President Joe Biden in November. Trump won the first nominating contest by significant margins before losing to Haley in America's capital city. The former president is also expected to win almost all nominating contests going forward, opinion polls show. Washington, D.C. is 100% urban, and relatively high proportion of residents hold a college degree. The core of Trump's base skews rural, and he is particularly strong in areas with low educational attainment. So, repeating the central narrative about Donald Trump, the official story is that Trump gets rural voters and uneducated voters. And of course, last week, MSNBC turned the Sauron's eye of the hate movement toward white, rural American voters, featuring interviews with the two co-authors of a book called White Rural Rage.
Joining us now, Professor of Political Science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Tom Schaller, and journalist and opinion writer Paul Waldman. Their new book, out tomorrow, is entitled White Rural Rage, the Threat to American Democracy. And Tom, we'll start with you. Why are white rural voters a threat to democracy at this point? You would think, as we pointed out, looking at Joe Biden's background and Donald Trump's, that the opposite would be true.
I mean, we lay out the fourfold interconnected threat that white rural voters pose to the country. First of all, and we show 30 polls and national studies to demonstrate this. So we provide the receipts in Chapter 6. They are the most racist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and anti-gay geodemographic group in the country. Second, they're the most conspiracist group. QAnon support and subscribers, election denialism, COVID denialism and scientific skepticism, Obama birtherism. Third, anti-democratic sentiments. They don't believe in an independent press, free speech. They're most likely to say the president should be able to act unilaterally without any checks from Congress or the courts or the bureaucracy. They're also the most strongly white nationalist and white Christian nationalists. And fourth, they are most likely to excuse or justify violence as an acceptable alternative to peaceful public discourse.
So you mentioned a lot of negative factors about this demographic.
Could you imagine if their book was called Black Urban Rage, A Threat to Democracy? And of course you couldn't, because that book would never be published. And if it was, the authors would never appear online to tell the country about how a specific demographic defined by their skin color and the population density of where they lived made them a threat to democracy. What you just heard there is rampant, blatant bigotry directed at a vulnerable and marginalized segment of our society on the basis that their skin color alone means they can be insulted in any way the regime chooses, because it always qualifies as punching up. Everybody knows it's the whites that have always been in power. Therefore, it's okay to say terrible things about them if they live far away from the cosmopolitan environment created by the communists in our cities. They are trying to reassert a stereotypical image of the average Trump supporter so that that person can be othered, can be marginalized, and can be insulted without being considered victims, because our society already defines white voters as the oppressor class. They claim these are the primary Trump voters. Then they claim all Trump voters are like these people. And so in the eyes or the ears of anyone who is in the process of waking up and considering, hey, maybe Donald Trump is the guy we should support, they're being told by the mainstream media that if you choose to associate yourself politically with this man, you are also associating yourself with all of these people. And unless you want us to refer to you the way we refer to them, you need to make sure you're not supporting Trump. Or if you are supporting Trump, you better not let anyone know. Because if anyone finds out, oh boy, you're going to get punished. This is the 2015-2016 playbook over again. And going back to Reuters, we are also, of course, having it reaffirmed that educated voters don't vote for Donald Trump. And of course, that means college educated. And we are still supposed to assume that everybody knows the college educated are the smarter people. They have a better quote unquote education, which means that they know more and they're better at thinking. And that, my friends, is why they don't vote for Donald Trump. And of course, the other advantage of framing it this way is that rural areas have very low population density. And the way that's portrayed to people in cities and to people in the suburbs is that no one actually lives out there. Everyone lives in the cities. That's the real America. And so they're the people who should get to decide, not these white rural voters filled with rage, loving Donald Trump. Their preferences alone and their lifestyles make them a threat to democracy. That's right. The voters themselves are the threat to democracy. Returning to Reuters. The city is also home to a significant number of federal workers who Trump allies have pledged to fire en masse and replace with loyalists if he wins in November. Some categories of federal workers have seen an increase in death threats in recent years, and Trump often refers to the D.C. area as the swamp. And apparently we are supposed to be offended and horrified by all this. Haley will pick up 19 delegates from her win, a small portion of the 1,215 delegates needed to clinch the nomination. Her victory could inoculate her from criticisms that she is unable to win a single nominating contest, though some Republicans will see her popularity in Washington as a negative. Many party leaders, Trump included, portray the city as crime-infested and run by out-of-touch elites. This is not the first time the Republicans in the Capitol have rejected Trump. During the last competitive Republican nominating contest in the District of Columbia in 2016, Trump received less than 14% of the vote and no delegates, even as he went on to win the nomination nationally. Politico covered the Haley win yesterday. Nikki Haley wins D.C. primary, first victory for campaign. And in this article, they frame her win in similar terms. The people who actually know what's going on, they voted for Nikki Haley. You see, in all these other places, it's just dumbasses, Trump voters, rural people, the uneducated. That's who's propelling Trump to all of these victories. Whereas once you get into Washington, D.C., that's where you have the real important voters, the people who know what's going on. And of course, they make the right decisions on everything. That's why Washington, D.C. is such a wonderful foreign city to live in. And just a couple examples from this article. This universe is a little more sophisticated than just about any universe in any other state, said Patrick Mara, chair of the D.C. Republican Party. I listen to the political podcasts in the morning. I read the newsletters throughout the day. That's probably like half the people showing up at this. Man, the D.C. Republican Party must be on fire with this guy at the helm. He listens to podcasts in the morning and reads newsletters. Oh, wow. A high information voter we've got here. What does he listen to? New York Times' The Daily? Does he get really edgy and put Megyn Kelly on after that? Dan Schuberth, who runs a trade association in downtown D.C. and supported Haley in the primary, described his fellow D.C. Republicans as a, quote, pretty unique electorate, end quote. Perhaps the only in the country where many of the voters personally know the people working for one or both of the campaigns. You got a really dialed in political class, Schuberth said of the Republicans voting this weekend. You know, folks read Politico. They read The Hill. Folks here are reading the Washington Post. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an example of the educated Republican voter. This is the Republican establishment that has controlled the Republican Party now for decades. They read The Hill. They read Politico. They read the Washington Post. They listen to the podcast. They read the newsletters. They've got their finger on the pulse, which makes it very strange that they are wrong about everything absolutely all the time and end up voting for neocon warmongers who have no chance of winning anything. But I know, if we're not nice to them, then they won't unify with us. They're more than happy to unify with us if we are up for supporting Nikki Haley, but otherwise they're not going to move our direction. And why would they? They're the sophisticated people who know what's going on. They read Politico, they read The Hill, they read the Washington Post, they listen to the podcasts in the morning, and they read the newsletters. Maybe if the rest of the Republican voters around the country, maybe if those MAGA voters listened to the podcasts in the morning and read the newsletters in the mainstream media, maybe they would know that Nikki Haley is the right candidate for the job. And it's also their last chance before they actually have to simply admit that they are Democrats now. Now, we've talked here and there about Nikki Haley potentially becoming a third-party candidate, maybe for the No Labels Party. I think it was just last week we discussed that. But of course, you got to remember that all of the candidates who participated in the fake GOP primary debates signed a pledge committing themselves to support the eventual Republican nominee as a qualification for participating in those debates. Donald Trump was broadly criticized for not signing that pledge. He was being unfaithful to the Republican Party. But now that principle no longer matters. Nikki Haley has simply decided to reverse her position on that pledge.
Let me try it this way. You did sign a pledge, an RNC pledge, to support the eventual nominee. Do you still feel bound by that pledge?
I have always said that I have serious concerns about Donald Trump. I have even more concerns about Joe Biden.
So is that a no? Are you bound by the RNC pledge?
The RNC pledge, at the time of the debate, we had to take it to where would you support the nominee? And you had to, in order to get on that debate stage, you said yes. The RNC is now not the same RNC. Now it's
so you're no
Trump's
longer bound
daughter-in-law.
by that pledge.
No, I think I'll make what decision I want to make, but that's not something I'm thinking about. And I think that while y'all think about that, I'm looking at the fact that we had thousands of people in Virginia. We're headed to North Carolina. We're going to continue to go to Vermont and Maine and all these states to go and show people that there is a path forward. And so I don't look at what ifs.
I look at how do we continue the conversation.
So Nikki Haley signed the pledge in order to participate in the debates, but now the Republican National Committee has supposedly changed in some important way, and that provides her with some justification for going against what she had pledged to do. Nikki Haley 2024. She will keep her promises unless she decides she doesn't want to. Donald Trump responded to Nikki Haley's quote-unquote win in the fake Washington, D.C. primary on Truth Social, writing, "I purposely stayed away from the D.C. vote because it is the swamp with very few delegates and no upside. Bird Brain spent all of her time, money, and effort there. Over the weekend, we won Missouri, Idaho, and Michigan. Big numbers. Complete destruction of a very weak opponent. The really big numbers will come on Super Tuesday, also way up on Crooked Joe. All of that is true. He did win the Michigan caucus. Obviously, we discussed the Michigan primary last week. They had multiple events to determine how the delegates were going to be apportioned. Donald Trump dominated both events." He went on in a second post. "Bird Brain is a loser. Record low performance in virtually every state. DeSantis easily beat her in Iowa for a very distant second place, and then she ran up to the podium before he had a chance to do so and claimed victory. I enjoy watching the Bird disavow her pledge to the RNC and her statement that she would never run against President Trump." And he quotes her in parentheses, "a great president." Well, she ran, she lied, and she lost big. Also interesting and notable that he referred to Ron DeSantis as DeSanctus, because initially after Ron's capitulation, Donald Trump seemed to indicate that he was accepting whatever truce was provided by Ron DeSantis, saying that he would support Donald Trump. And I guess it remains to be seen how he might do that if he ever does. Changing subjects without a segue, this is the Washington Post from yesterday. Lawmakers pick Pakistan's leader, but Khan's shadow looms from prison. And so this being a big election year, not just in the United States, but worldwide, we've been tracking the results of those elections and the processes, the claims of fraud, their election systems. And we've been tracking the results of Pakistan's election and all the manipulations, irregularities, and malfeasance as the regime in India tried to bar former Prime Minister Imran Khan's PTI party from winning any representation in their election. They actually went so far as to imprison Imran Khan. Let's go to the Washington Post. Pakistan's parliament elected Shahbaz Sharif to a second term as prime minister on Sunday, handing the country a reprieve after months of political turmoil. But analysts and Sharif's opponents say the respite won't last long. Sharif, whose Pakistan Muslim League party has no absolute majority in parliament, struggled to find political allies in the wake of last month's general election. Pakistan had been led by a caretaker cabinet since August, when the Sharif-led government completed its term, paving the way for the election. For now, Sharif's government is being backed by a range of rivals. It will face particularly fierce resistance from allies of imprisoned former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who vastly exceeded expectations last month and whose emboldened supporters staged nationwide protests on Saturday. On Sunday, Sharif beat Omar Ayub Khan, the candidate backed by Khan's party, with 201 votes to 92. After being elected, Sharif urged Parliament to, quote, come together. But his speech was drowned out by Khan's allies, who called Sharif a thief, accusing him of stealing their votes. Sharif's term is likely to be overshadowed by lingering allegations of electoral fraud from Khan's Movement for Justice Party, or Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which appeared to have a commanding lead in unofficial polls released immediately after voting stations closed on February 8th. Khan's allies claim that Pakistani officials, shocked by the strong public support for the imprisoned ex-leader, slowed down vote counting and rigged the results, an accusation that the authorities have denied. But even among Khan's opponents, the sentiment that fairness is lacking in Pakistani politics remains widespread. Skipping ahead, Khan's party was almost entirely dismantled after his supporters attacked military installations in the wake of his arrest on corruption charges in May. But subsequent convictions and prison terms in 3 trials did not break the ex-leader's popularity and may have even bolstered it. The PTI's savvy use of social media in recent months successfully circumvented efforts to undermine Khan's populist pitches to voters, which largely revolve around disrupting the status quo of Pakistani politics and building a nationalistic European-style welfare state based on Islamic values. Khan and his party, quote, have changed the dynamics of Pakistani politics and remain the elephant in the room, a force to be reckoned with, a force that cannot be wished away, end quote. Said Musahid Hussain Syed, a Pakistani senator long allied with Sharif's parties. While Khan's party still appears far from dominating on the national level, there are signs that last month's vote has upended the status quo. Party leaders and supporters who had gone underground amid fears of arrest have resurfaced. On Pakistani television, talk show hosts and guests now openly discuss electoral fraud allegations. And after months in which most television channels barely, if ever, mention the PTI or Khan, its members are being invited back onto programs. No one can stop us, said Muhammad Jamshed Khan, a lawyer who attended nationwide PTI demonstrations Saturday to protest alleged electoral fraud. Not only will we get Khan out of prison, but we will also make him prime minister. So it seems that for now, they have kept Khan's party from taking official power, but their unofficial power, their popularity with the people, and their influence continuing to grow, these are all good signs. The landscape is changing, not just here, but worldwide, and in all of these countries that have dealt with regime influence for years or decades to the point where their elections no longer actually give the people a say in how the government runs. Sometimes just this momentum, the narratives that surround it, and the public understanding of the fact that the system is rigged against them, all of that constitutes legitimate progress from outside of these supposed official channels. The ridiculous globalists at the Brookings Institution published this article on Thursday, Pakistan's surprising and marred 2024 election and what comes next. And we're going to skip down close to the end here. And here they're discussing the election results overall, not the prime minister in particular. Writing, this was a vote against the status quo, against the Pakistani military's political meddling and the dominance of its old guard, the dynastic parties, and one for Khan. Khan has upended Pakistanis' relationship with their military over the past 2 years after he pointedly blamed the once hallowed institution for his dismissal. Skipping ahead. To overcome the barriers the PTI faced in campaigning, the party ran a methodical and modern campaign, using artificial intelligence and social media effectively, as well as secret canvassing. By contrast, the PMLN, that's Shahbaz Sharif's party, ran a campaign that seemed set in the 1990s in its erstwhile base, Punjab province. On election day, voters showed up at the polls informed on who the PTI-backed independent candidates were, even as each one was assigned a different electoral symbol, ranging from carrots to charpoys. I have no idea what that is, nor will I look it up. They broke the pattern of voting for electables, prominent Pakistani politicians well-versed in patronage politics, instead voting along party lines regardless of the candidate's prior political experience. Now, again, the reason I think that these foreign elections are so important is that we get to read through the mainstream interpretation of all of the narratives, the circumstances, the manipulations, the candidates, all of it. This is a very heavily globalist-oriented communist think tank here in the United States of America, where Norm Eisen is one of the key figures. Norm Eisen at Brookings was involved in the preparation of all these reports that led directly to the Trump indictments. Brookings is one of the homes of the coup plotters, the people who have spent nearly a decade now trying to tarnish Donald Trump, subvert his presidency, and prevent his voters from having any say not only in the elections, but also in the public conversation. I mean, of course, they did all this in order to protect democracy, but no one really believes that. Let's skip down to the end of this Brookings piece, The Aftermath. Despite the election day surprise, Pakistan will get a government that looks very much like the one that came in after Khan's ouster. The second and third largest parties in parliament, the PMLN and PPP, have joined hands once again to form a coalition government. Members of parliament took their oaths of office on February 29th. The election of the prime minister is scheduled to be held on March 3rd. And of course, that's what we just went through in the Washington Post article. Surprisingly, Nawaz Sharif is out of the fold. His brother Shahbaz, who was prime minister from April 2022 to August 2023 and is more palatable to Pakistan's military because of his consistent pro-establishment stance, is the coalition's nominee for prime minister. PTI independents have joined with a smaller party in an effort to claim reserved seats. The party did not enter negotiations with the PMLN and PPP. This was no surprise. Khan's populist politics relies on opposition to these two parties. Without uniting with the PMLN or PPP, the PTI did not have a realistic path to government in a parliamentary system. So the PTI is the populist party in Pakistan. They do not want to unite with the two establishment parties. And the parallel here is obvious. MAGA is not interested in compromising with the uniparty right or the uniparty left. We can, quote unquote, form a government, if you will, though we don't have a parliamentary system. We can govern aligned with the uniparty right if it's absolutely necessary, but it's not absolutely necessary. And we should not hesitate to criticize the Republican Party establishment. That does not weaken us for future elections. It strengthens us, and it forces the establishment to move in our direction, which is the entire purpose. We have the leverage. The leverage must be used. We do not need to put ourselves in a position of groveling before the uniparty establishment. We do not need them. They need us. I personally have no problem playing spoiler to the uniparty right if they're unable to do what's right vis-a-vis the American people and continue to do what they have to do to support the uniparty. We don't have to compromise with these evil and corrupt people. Back to the article. Meanwhile, the PTI is protesting the election result on the streets and in the courts. Multiple parties have raised allegations that the elections were rigged, and the media, civil society organizations, and the U.S. and other Western governments have joined the growing call for investigations of alleged election fraud. However, these claims are likely to get short shrift in Pakistan, where the legal system has worked largely in concert with the establishment this election cycle, as in the past. The Election Commission, whose faulty performance has been called out across the board, has gone silent. The incoming coalition government will function as a junior partner to the military. Shahbaz's government handed over unprecedented power to the army in 2023, and it is likely to continue to do so in this term as well. It is little surprise that Pakistan was downgraded to an authoritarian regime for 2023 by the Economist Intelligence Unit. Oh, wow. The Economist has its own intelligence unit. The government faces hard tasks ahead, especially in terms of the economy. It will need to enter a new agreement with the International Monetary Fund as soon as the current one ends in March, and will also need to consider debt restructuring soon after, as massive loans totaling about $24 billion come due in the next few months. There is reason to be wary. Neither of the coalition parties has a sound record of economic prudence or growth. The Army is now also directly involved in the economy via the Army Chief's membership on a Special Investment Facilitation Council. In the end, if the military gets the weak coalition government it wanted, the better to control it. Through an election that was neither free nor fair, does the surprise result on Election Day really matter? It does. Pakistan citizens are restive and dissatisfied. Their already frayed compact with the establishment broken. The military, which projects itself as the guarantor of stability in Pakistan, has since 2022 generated the worst political crisis the country has seen in decades. Far from returning Pakistan to some modicum of stability, the election's conduct has accentuated political tensions in the country. As a result, the incoming coalition government is likely to be unstable. The military failed at decimating the PTI after the most heavy-handed crackdown a party has seen in recent decades, and Pakistanis saw that. They have realized the power of their votes, and they will use it again. All right, so fake primaries and obviously rigged and manipulated elections following the imprisonment of a political opponent and the banning of that opponent's party. Let's talk about an attempt to rig and manipulate an election by banning Donald Trump from participating in the fake primary or the rigged election. So let's first get the official story from the New York Times. Trump prevails in Supreme Court challenge to his eligibility. Here's the latest. The Supreme Court ruled on Monday that states may not bar former President Donald J. Trump from running for another term, rejecting a challenge to his eligibility that threatened to upend the presidential race by taking him off ballots around the nation. Though the justices provided different reasons, the decision was unanimous. All the opinions focused on legal issues, and none took a position on whether Mr. Trump had engaged in insurrection. And let's take just a second on that. The lower court decision in Colorado that started this whole controversy through this appeals process that eventually wound up at the Supreme Court, that case had a long written opinion in the decision that was handed down. And at the end of that opinion, the judge accepted the sham J6 committee's report as evidence that Donald Trump had engaged in insurrection. So the opinion incorporated that decision, agreeing that Trump had committed insurrection. And on the basis of committing insurrection, the court determined that Jenna Griswold had grounds to bar Donald Trump from appearing on the Colorado ballot. Now, that decision was immediately stayed until it went through the appeals process. So in Colorado, where they will hold their fake primary tomorrow, Trump's name will appear on the ballot. Now, there are a few different grounds that Trump, through his attorneys, could have contested this lower court decision, but this case wasn't about fact-finding in whether or not Donald Trump had committed insurrection. Though the opinion does address it at times, this decision is more focused on whether or not the states are allowed to do this in the first place. So even if Donald Trump had committed insurrection, the court has decided that states are not allowed to take it upon themselves in deciding to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment under their interpretation. Back to the New York Times. All the justices agreed that individual states may not bar candidates for the presidency under a constitutional provision, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that forbids insurrectionists from holding office. 4 justices would have left it at that. But a 5-justice majority, in an unsigned opinion, went on to say that Congress must act to give Section 3 force. And that is what was published as the majority opinion. The 3 communists on the court, appointed by Barack Obama and Joe Biden, published their own concurring opinion, which we will get to in a bit. Justice Amy Coney Barrett also wrote a short opinion of her own. Back to the official story. The Constitution makes Congress, rather than the states, responsible for enforcing Section 3 against federal office holders and candidates, the majority wrote, adding that detailed federal legislation was required to determine who was disqualified under the provision. So the idea here is that in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, when the 14th Amendment was passed, after, by the way, they barred certain states from participating in the ratification of these Reconstruction amendments, those who represented the so-called winning side of the Civil War wanted to be sure that they could bar their political opposition from participating in the American government. They would not be allowed to weigh in on how the government would function moving forward because they had committed insurrection. Now, I've talked many times over the last couple of months about a book called Our Secret Constitution by George P. Fletcher, who is a Columbia University law professor and an avowed leftist. He argues in that book that it is a good thing that during the Civil War, the priority became replacing the old Constitution with a new one. And Fletcher argues that that was accomplished through these Reconstruction amendments. They replaced the idea of liberty with the idea of equality. They replaced the sovereign individual with the nation, and they replaced the republic with our democracy. That is a complete and total subversion of the founders' intent. They essentially reversed the Constitution. They made it something that would allow for global, quote unquote, democracy. We certainly weren't taught about this in school. We were not taught that what the Civil War was about was changing our country from a republic into a quote unquote democracy, putting the needs of the nation above the needs of the individual while simultaneously foregoing liberty for enforced equality. But the key was, with this amendment, it became the Congress's duty to enforce the provisions of the amendment, and they would have to pass legislation in order to enforce those provisions whenever the need arose. The court has ruled that it is Congress's responsibility to figure out the enforcement mechanism of this amendment. So Section 3 of this amendment must be enforced by an act of Congress. That is what they are saying. Now, a key part of the argument prior to this decision was whether or not Donald Trump qualified as an officer, quote unquote, under the Constitution. And that wasn't as much a part of the decision today. The Times wrote his primary argument in the U.S. Supreme Court was that the president was not one of the officials covered by Section 3, which does not mention that office by name. That argument did not attract votes on Monday. So the question of whether or not Trump qualified as an officer under this provision was not the crux of the decision today. The key was that the states were not the proper place for this issue to be decided. It was up to Congress to enact legislation to enforce this part of the 14th Amendment. And while the decision was 9-0 in agreement that the Colorado Secretary of State simply could not decide to remove a presidential candidate from Colorado's ballot. But as the article notes, only 5 of the justices totally concurred with the opinion published by the court. Though the 3 communists on the court sided with Trump, they disagreed with the majority's approach, and most of the focus has just been on the final outcome of this case. People are celebrating the win, and that's all good. The court made the right decision. This is what should happen, and we can be happy about it. But this is crossing a very low bar. Everything about this case has been ridiculous from the start. It's been nearly a month since the oral arguments, and from that moment on, no one really thought the court would not side with Trump. It became immediately obvious the court was going to decide in Trump's favor on this one. But let's go through the opinion written by the 3 communist justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson. If it is not necessary to decide more to dispose of a case, then it is necessary not to decide more. Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. So that is the Dobbs decision from 2022. These 3 justices are citing it right off the bat. That is the decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. And the principle they're citing here from John Roberts is the principle that the court's role is simply to decide the issue at hand and not go beyond that. Now, it is, of course, spectacularly hypocritical for activist judges to be arguing with this, but hey, that's just where we are. Let's continue. That fundamental principle of judicial restraint is practically as old as our republic. This court is authorized, quote, to say what the law is, end quote, only because, quote, those who apply a rule to particular cases must of necessity expound and interpret that rule, end quote. And that was from Marbury versus Madison, which we talk about from time to time. That is the case in which the court ruled that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void. The 3 justices write, today the court departs from that vital principle, deciding not just this case, but the challenges that might arise in the future. In this case, the court must decide whether Colorado may keep a presidential candidate off the ballot on the grounds that he is an oath-breaking insurrectionist and thus disqualified from holding federal office under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Allowing Colorado to do so would, we agree, create a chaotic state-by-state patchwork at odds with our nation's federalism principles. That is enough to resolve this case. And let's take a pause right there, because that is a consequentialist argument. They're not saying that deciding the other way would be a violation of constitutional principles as written. They're saying that deciding the other way would lead to bad outcomes. Therefore, that on its own is enough for them not to decide that way. And that is the sort of argument we hear from the left, from activist judges. They make their court decisions based on what outcome it might affect. That's not how it's supposed to be done. They're supposed to be ruling on constitutionality. Back to the opinion. Yet the majority goes further. Even though, quote, all 9 members of the court, end quote, agree that this independent and sufficient rationale resolves this case, 5 justices go on. They decide novel constitutional questions to insulate this court and petitioner from future controversy. Although only an individual state's action is at issue here, the majority opines on which federal actors can enforce Section 3 and how they must do so. The majority announces that a disqualification for insurrection can only occur when Congress enacts a particular kind of legislation pursuant to Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. In doing so, the majority shuts the door on other potential means of federal enforcement. We cannot join an opinion that decides momentous and difficult issues unnecessarily, and therefore we concur only in the judgment. So they're arguing that the court's decision actually advocates for a particular understanding of the issue and in addition recommends a particular process for actually enforcing Section 3. Our Constitution leaves some questions to the states while committing others to the federal government. Federalism principles embedded in that constitutional structure decide this case. States cannot use their control over the ballot to, quote, undermine the national government, citing term limits versus Thornton. That danger is even greater, quote, in the context of a presidential election, end quote, citing Anderson versus Celebrezze. State restrictions in that context, quote, implicate a uniquely important national interest, end quote, extending beyond a state's, quote, own borders. No doubt, states have significant, quote, authority over presidential electors, end quote, and in turn presidential elections, citing Chiafalo versus Washington. That power, however, is limited by other constitutional constraints, including federalism principles. The majority rests on such principles when it explains why Colorado cannot take petitioner off the ballot. Quote, state-by-state resolution of the question whether Section 3 bars a particular candidate for president from serving, end quote, the majority explains, quote, would be quite unlikely to yield a uniform answer consistent with the basic principle that the president represents all voters in the nation. That is especially so, the majority adds, because different states can reach, quote, conflicting outcomes concerning the same candidate, not just from differing views of the merits, but from variations in state law governing the proceedings, end quote, to enforce Section 3. The contrary conclusion that a handful of officials in a few states could decide the nation's next president would be especially surprising with respect to Section 3. The Reconstruction Amendments, quote, were specifically designed as an expansion of federal power and an intrusion on state sovereignty. And they're citing City of Rome versus the United States from 1980. Section 3 marked the first time the Constitution placed substantive limits on a state's authority to choose its own officials. Given that context, it would defy logic for Section 3 to give states new powers to determine who may hold the presidency. So as you can see, they would side with Fletcher on this, sounding gleeful almost that the federal government took this power from the states. They're saying the amendment itself was specifically designed as an expansion of federal power versus the states. They're pulling power away from the states and into the federal government. Now, Fletcher likes this. The communists on the court like this. It's just not what the Constitution was written to do. But of course, under their understanding, if this amendment was designed to pull power away from the states and toward the federal government, then it couldn't simultaneously also suggest that states get to decide who can't be president of the entire United States. These 3 justices, quote, the prior case, it would be incongruous to read this particular amendment as granting the states the power, silently no less, to disqualify a candidate for federal office. That provides a secure and sufficient basis to resolve this case. To allow Colorado to take a presidential candidate off the ballot under Section 3 would imperil the framers' vision of a, quote, federal government directly responsible to the people, end quote. the court should have started and ended its opinion with this conclusion. Yet the court continues on to resolve questions not before us. In a case involving no federal action whatsoever, the court opines on how federal enforcement of Section 3 must proceed. Congress, the majority says, must enact legislation under Section 5 prescribing the procedures to, quote, ascertain what particular individuals, end quote, should be disqualified. The justices write, these musings are as inadequately supported as they are gratuitous. To start, nothing in Section 3's text supports the majority's view of how federal disqualification efforts must operate. Section 3 states simply that no person shall hold certain positions and offices if they are oath-breaking insurrectionists. Nothing in that unequivocal bar suggests that implementing legislation enacted under Section 5 is quote-unquote critical, or for that matter, what the word means in this context. In fact, the text cuts the opposite way. Section 3 provides that when an oath-breaking insurrectionist is disqualified, quote, Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such a disability, end quote. It is hard to understand why the Constitution would require a congressional supermajority to remove a disqualification if a simple majority could nullify Section 3's operation by repealing or declining to pass implementing legislation. Even petitioner's lawyer acknowledged the tension in Section 3 that the majority's view creates. Similarly, nothing else in the rest of the 14th Amendment supports the majority's view. Section 5 gives Congress the power, quote, to enforce the amendment by appropriate legislation, end quote. Remedial legislation of any kind, however, is not required. All the Reconstruction amendments, including the due process and equal protection guarantees and prohibition of slavery, quote, are self-executing, end quote, meaning that they do not depend on legislation. They are citing there the city of Byrne versus Flores and civil rights cases from 1883. Similarly, other constitutional rules of disqualification, like the 2-term limit on the presidency, do not require implementing legislation. Nor does the majority suggest otherwise. It simply creates a special rule for the insurrection disability in Section 3. The majority is left with next to no support for its requirement that a Section 3 disqualification can occur only pursuant to legislation enacted for that purpose. It cites Griffin's case, but that is non-precedental lower court opinion by a single justice in his capacity as a circuit judge. Once again, even petitioner's lawyer distanced himself from fully embracing this case as probative of Section 3's meaning. The majority also cites Senator Trumbull's statements that Section 3, quote, provided no means for enforcement itself. The majority, however, neglects to mention the senator's view that, quote, it is the 14th Amendment that prevents a person from holding office, end quote, with the proposed legislation simply, quote, affording a more efficient and speedy remedy, end quote, for effecting the disqualification. Ultimately, under the guise of providing a more complete explanation for the judgment, the majority resolves many unsettled questions about Section 3. It forecloses judicial enforcement of that provision, such as might occur when a party is prosecuted by an insurrectionist and raises a defense on that score. The majority further holds that any legislation to enforce this provision must prescribe certain procedures, quote unquote, tailored to Section 3, ruling out enforcement under general federal statutes requiring the government to comply with the law. By resolving these and other questions, the majority attempts to insulate all alleged insurrectionists from future challenges to their holding federal office. Citing Bush v. Gore, the 3 justices write, what it does today, the court should have left undone. The court today needed to resolve only a single question: whether an individual state may keep a presidential candidate found to have engaged in insurrection off its ballot. The majority resolves much more than the case before us. Although federal enforcement of Section 3 is in no way at issue, the majority announces novel rules for how that enforcement must operate. It reaches out to decide Section 3 questions not before us and to foreclose future efforts to disqualify a presidential candidate under that provision. In a sensitive case crying out for judicial restraint, it abandons that course. Section 3 serves as an important, though rarely needed, role in our democracy. The American people have the power to vote for and elect candidates for national office, and that is a great and glorious thing. The men who drafted and ratified the 14th Amendment, however, had witnessed an, quote, insurrection and rebellion, end quote, to defend slavery. And again, that is becoming more and more obviously a canard. Even George Fletcher in Our Secret Constitution argues that even during the Civil War, the war was not about slavery. It was about replacing the Constitution. And he says this proudly. They wanted to ensure that those who had participated in that insurrection and in possible future insurrections could not return to prominent roles. Today, the majority goes beyond the necessities of this case to limit how Section 3 can bar an oath-breaking insurrectionist from becoming president. Although we agree that Colorado cannot enforce Section 3, we protest the majority's effort to use this case to define the limits of federal enforcement of that provision. Because we would decide only the issue before us, we concur only in the judgment. So they agree that the states cannot take a presidential candidate off the ballot. They worry that that could have terrible consequences in the future. It would be chaos. We discussed this following the oral arguments. Democrat states would be able to kick Trump off the ballot. Republican states could kick Biden off the ballot. And the election wouldn't be decided by voters or even congressional delegations. It would simply be decided by which states had which candidates on the ballot. If you could make sure that one candidate was barred from the ballot on enough states to go above that 270 electoral college votes, then the election would be decided before a single voter cast a ballot. But the three communists on the court are unhappy with how the majority has, in their view, laid out the process for removal via Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And I want to talk about that specifically, but first, a couple of notes from the majority opinion in this case. And as I often do, I was discussing some of this with my friend and Badlands Media founder, John Harold, this morning, kind of comparing notes on what we found interesting in this case. And I want to quickly share something he pointed out. He highlighted this segment of the majority opinion where they write, certain evidence, like the congressional report on which the lower courts relied here, might be admissible in some states, but inadmissible hearsay in other states. And when they say inadmissible, I think that they are probably referring to a technical understanding of this report's qualifications as evidence. But it's hard not to read this as a knock on the J6 committee's report when they note that some states might consider it hearsay. And of course, it is hearsay. It's not evidence. It is a report authored by a congressional committee that was set up in violation of the Congress's own rules. Republicans were only allowed 2 seats on that committee, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. Kevin McCarthy, the speaker at the time, was not allowed to choose who those 2 members would be. There was no ranking member on that committee. There was no opportunity for cross-examination of any of the witnesses by an opposing party who might not agree with them. It was a kangaroo court. It was a show trial. It was a primetime television show produced by an actual television producer. And the people involved were aware of that the whole time. The goal was to tell a story to the nation, to get the nation on the same page about what happened on January 6th. It was an insurrection. They decided. They did not convict Donald Trump of insurrection. They did not convict Donald Trump of anything. Nor did the whole Congress, nor has any court. Donald Trump is not a convicted insurrectionist. Donald Trump's identification as an oath-breaking insurrectionist is strictly a matter of opinion, not supported by the facts. It is a ridiculous assertion. Donald Trump was president at the time. He could not possibly have staged an insurrection against the country of which he is the president. The claim that Donald Trump is an insurrectionist has the air of being an official finding because of this committee, at least within the mainstream understanding, but that doesn't actually make it real. Donald Trump is not a convicted insurrectionist. He's not even an accused insurrectionist in any official capacity. It is only a matter of opinion, and it was put on display in a primetime television show that was made to seem like a legitimate congressional committee, but simply was not one. But who knows? If they're able to use a motion to vacate to move Mike Johnson out of his role as Speaker of the illegitimate House of Representatives and place someone else into that role, is it possible that the Congress might then decide to vote on whether or not to accept the illegitimate sham J6 committee's opinion as the official position of Congress? So the Congress would pass a resolution to declare that Donald Trump was indeed an oath-breaking insurrectionist. And then at that point, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment would be self-enforcing, and Donald Trump would be deemed ineligible to serve as President of the United States of America. Now, while most of the analysis after the oral arguments focused on people predicting what the final outcome would be, would it be 9-0? Would it be 8-1? Would it be 7-2? I was more focused on a different argument. I expressed it here. We also talked about it a few times on Badlands. This is me on Badlands Daily from Friday, the 9th of February.
Here is the exchange between Ketanji Brown Jackson and this lawyer for Colorado, Jason Murray. She asks, if we think that the states can't enforce this provision for whatever reason, what happens next to this case? I mean, is it done? And he says that the case would be done, but I think it could come back with a vengeance because ultimately members of Congress may have to make the determination after a presidential election if Trump wins about whether or not he's disqualified from office and whether to count votes for him under the Electoral Count Reform Act. That is a hypothetical. If Trump wins in November, could the Congress then vote that he is ineligible under this same clause, having committed insurrection, to serve as president, and it will be a lame duck Congress making that vote? That is what they are setting up for now. We talked about this last week. Last Monday, the New York Times ran their article about Joe Biden's strategy to become president again. They mentioned the Taylor Swift thing. We talked about getting caught up in the Taylor Swift of it all. And there was that one paragraph that said the real election would be on January 6th, 2025. I also mentioned Liz Cheney in an interview with Jake Tapper a couple of months ago. Talks about how she's going to work to get Democrats elected so that they have a congressional majority going in to the certification of electors in January. If you think they're not setting the predicate for there to be a battle over those electors from their side saying that Trump is ineligible to serve, you would be mistaken. They are clearly setting this up.
All right. Now, what cued me in listening to the oral arguments in this case was the question about whether, if Congress was deemed to be the proper venue for determining whether or not Trump was eligible, would that be something they might pursue and when? And I suggested on this show that that might have been the plan the entire time. I can't imagine that the regime actually thought they were going to get Donald Trump off the ballot and that would just be accepted by all Americans. So they pushed this ridiculous case through the courts, got some decisions in their favor on the assumption that Trump was in fact an oath-breaking insurrectionist, rather than that just being someone's opinion, with the goal of getting an opinion on how someone could be removed under the 14th Amendment. And that's basically the decision here. The court writes in the majority opinion, discussing the hypothetical of a presidential candidate being removed by the states, for the reasons given, responsibility for enforcing Section 3 against federal office holders and candidates rests with the Congress, not the states. The opinion reads, the patchwork that would likely result from the state enforcement would, quote, sever the direct link that the framers found so critical between the national government and the people of the United States as a whole. But in a presidential election, the impact of the votes cast in each state is affected by the votes cast, or in this case, the votes not allowed to be cast, for the various candidates in other states. An evolving electoral map could dramatically change the behavior of voters, parties, and states across the country in different ways and at different times. the disruption would be all the more acute and could nullify the votes of millions and change the election result if Section 3 enforcement were attempted after the nation has voted. Nothing in the Constitution requires that we endure such chaos, arriving at any time or different times up to and perhaps beyond the inauguration. And that is the recognition that if states are able to determine that a person is ineligible to serve as president even after the inauguration, we would have absolute chaos. And if states could determine that a president wasn't fit for the ballot based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, it would absolutely follow that the states could at any time claim that a president is ineligible to serve under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment for being an oath-breaking insurrectionist. This wouldn't only count for ballot access, this would count all the time. So the court gave the opinion that we anticipated a month ago in regard to the issue of whose responsibility it is to determine that a candidate has committed insurrection and is then ineligible to serve. And I would not be harping on this if this wasn't a plainly stated possibility and potentially even a strategy by the Uniparty to prevent Donald Trump from becoming once again the recognized president of the United States of America, even if it violates the direct stated goal of the American people. And so let's take just a second to review how often this point has been brought up recently. I mentioned the New York Times article about Joe Biden's winning strategies, the article that primarily focused on Taylor Swift's influence. In that article, the Times reporters write, the January 6th attack hangs over the Biden campaign in another way as well. Unlike in 2020, the president and his team believe that the end of the election will not be in November, but on January 6, 2025, when Congress will count the Electoral College votes. Now, that is some serious foreshadowing, and that is kind of dark and sinister. I've been told that the votes of the American people determine who wins a presidential election, and that happens on and by Election Day. I was told it was an insurrection to even contemplate objecting to electors at the certification. And it's definitely an insurrection to appoint alternate electors just because a state has held an unconstitutional election. But that's not all. I mentioned Liz Cheney. I said with Jake Tapper, I was wrong about that. She was actually on CBS Sunday Morning when she made the comments I was referring to.
In that book, Cheney itemizes each turn with Johnson before January 6th. A lot of attention for a name she expected few of her readers to know, but she felt Johnson's sleight of hand was emblematic of Republicans who don't just go along with Trump's deceptions, but boost them. She had no idea she was writing about a future speaker.
The Speaker of the House is a collaborator to overthrow the last election.
Absolutely.
What happens if Mike Johnson's the Speaker on the 6th of January, 2025?
He can't be. You know, we're facing a situation with respect to the 2024 election where it's an existential crisis, and we have to ensure that we don't have a situation where an election that might be thrown into the House of Representatives is overseen by a Republican majority.
So you would prefer a Democratic majority?
I believe very strongly in those principles and ideals that have defined the Republican Party. But the Republican Party of today has made a choice, and they haven't chosen the Constitution. And so I do think it presents a threat if the Republicans are in the majority in January 2025.
So Liz Cheney plans to support Democrats in their congressional races to guarantee a Democrat majority and make sure that Speaker Mike Johnson will not be Speaker on January 6th, 2025, because she too wants the quote unquote real election to be on January 6th, 2025, not on November 5th, 2024, Election Day. We were told that was an insurrection. Liz Cheney sounds like an insurrectionist here. If you've followed the show for a while, you will know that I think Mike Johnson actually will be removed as Speaker and replaced with either Hakeem Jeffries or Liz Cheney. So imagine Liz Cheney being Speaker of the totally illegitimate House and trying to remove Donald Trump by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment in Congress, where the Supreme Court has now decided that decision can be made. We also had this op-ed in The Guardian from a couple of weeks ago by Sidney Blumenthal. The headline is, "The U.S. Supreme Court may turn this election into a constitutional crisis." Blumenthal is a former Clinton aide and confidant of Hillary Clinton. He was employed by the Clinton Foundation. He is actually the father of Gray Zone founder and journalist Max Blumenthal. Sidney Blumenthal, a former journalist himself. I guess he's still a journalist. He's written for the Washington Post, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, The Guardian, of course, and a website called Open Democracy, among others. And he has been a bit controversial at times over the years and found himself embroiled in the Steele dossier issue. But to the article in The Guardian, he comes out swinging. Imagine it is 6 January 2025. The bell tolls for the day of the Electoral College certification again. All the events of 2024 converge. The U.S. Supreme Court's likely ruling in Trump versus Anderson, denying Colorado's disqualification of Trump under the Constitution's 14th Amendment, Section 3, the exoneration of Joe Biden by special counsel Robert Hur, the ruling on Trump's immunity, the trial for his coup attempt, and Texas Governor Greg Abbott's defiance of federal court rulings in deploying his National Guard to the border, supported by other Republican governors who have mobilized their Guard units in similar acts of nullification. All these happenings could hurtle to a convulsive confrontation. And of course, the Greg Abbott issue was a hot button issue 3 weeks ago, and no one talks about it anymore. Blumenthal writes with disappointment over the oral arguments, concerned that the Supreme Court justices hadn't read the amicus briefs written from the viewpoints with which Sidney Blumenthal agrees. He writes, "Start with the Supreme Court ruling that a state is not the proper body to determine a disqualification under the 14th Amendment, Section 3. That would, as the Ginsburg brief states, leave enforcement inevitably by a process of elimination to the Congress. The justices' frantic effort to escape responsibility for upholding the plain language of the 14th Amendment in the name of saving the country from a hypothetical political crisis would potentially create a very real constitutional one. In that light, the election result might prove irrelevant. The reason is that now, according to this scenario, the 119th Congress, sworn in on 3 January 2025, could reject the electors from states for Trump by deciding that he is an insurrectionist. The Supreme Court would have set the stage. If Democrats were to win the House, they could remove Trump. If the Republicans win control of the Senate, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who is no longer going to be Majority Leader, refusing to whip the vote for Trump, could allow a number of Republican senators to vote for Trump's disqualification, which would void his electoral votes by both chambers. And this suggests a kind of funny dynamic, where we would have the election, Donald Trump would be declared the winner, thus providing support. The media would then say, well, you can't claim election fraud. You can't claim that these elections were rigged or manipulated because Donald Trump won. Now, that is not the standard to determine whether or not elections are rigged and manipulated. It's the actual processes and the execution of the election. Donald Trump winning does not mean that the election was free and fair, safe and secure, and that the reported results accurately reflect the will and intent of the American voter. But standard issue villagers out there are not going to wrap their heads around that. They're going to assume that because Trump won, the elections are not stolen. And then that notion will be applied to all of the down ballot races as well. So the idea is the reaction to the announcement of Donald Trump as the winner will be that everyone assumes our elections are valid, and that will include all the down ballot races. And maybe they'll end up telling us that people wanted a split government, so they returned Democrats to power in Congress so that they could provide a check and balance to mitigate Donald Trump's worst impulses. But nothing about Donald Trump being announced the winner would indicate that the elections are free and fair, safe and secure, and that the reported results accurately reflect the will and intent of the American voter, not for Donald Trump and not for those down ballot races as well. So in this scenario, if they pull that, if they are able to create the Congress that they want to create, That Congress itself will not be legitimate. They're going to install the Congress they want if they are able to do that. And then that illegitimate Congress will be tasked with preventing Donald Trump from becoming the publicly recognized president once again. Back to Blumenthal in The Guardian. If there is a deadlock, the Ginsburg brief argues, the House still would have an option to remove Trump. Under the Electoral Vote Reform Act, the House would establish rules under the Constitution's 12th Amendment in which each state delegation gets one vote in the House. But before that would have taken place, the House could vote that Trump is excluded from a 12th Amendment ballot because he was disqualified under the 14th Amendment, Section 3. No one not on the ballot for president could be substituted, which means that Joe Biden would be reelected in any case. All along, throughout the entire campaign year, that would mean that Trump has never been qualified. And it would also mean that only the Supreme Court decision against Colorado made it seem that he was. He discusses some various hypotheticals and some fallout potentially from the Robert Hur report on Joe Biden's mental and physical fitness for the office, and then returned to the Ginsburg amicus brief and the discussion about removing Donald Trump's eligibility. Now imagine if the scenario of the Ginsburg brief is a catastrophe foretold, that all these events tumble unpredictably to 6 January and beyond. One of the analytic tools of historical understanding is to speculate on what might have happened if events took unexpected twists and turns. The proverb, for want of a nail, suggests that the absence of a minor factor produced a major outcome. In chaos theory, the butterfly effect describes the impact of seemingly random occurrences that set in motion a chain reaction leading to enormous change. The flapping of a butterfly's wings that results in a distant tornado. A Supreme Court ruling and a special counsel's report are more than a nail and butterfly's wings. So consider the possible effects in a not-so-distant future. Disqualified by the Congress, an enraged Trump files a suit before the Supreme Court. But that is just a gesture. After the 2020 election, he incited a mob to attack the Capitol. Suppose that now he calls on the Texas governor and other Republican governors to send National Guard units to enforce his election. Biden federalizes them, but the Republican governors proclaim that he has usurped power to keep himself in office illegitimately and that Trump is the truly elected president. Self-installed as the president of the de facto Second Confederacy, Trump's first act is to pardon himself of all federal crimes. He has called Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, and Benjamin Netanyahu to request that they recognize him as the true president. Putin offers him asylum. This is all obviously hypothetical. This is an absurd fever dream. As armies prepare to clash on a darkling plain, Trump's last-ditch appeal in the Manhattan election fraud case for paying hush money to a porn star goes against him. The New York Appellate Court announces it has upheld his prison sentence and fine. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida responds that while Trump might be the president, he will honor the extradition clause of the Constitution to deliver him from Mar-a-Lago as a fugitive from justice. Trump flees to Texas, where Governor Abbott refuses the extradition order. Trump proclaims he is president wherever he is. This is so absurd. The case for remanding Trump to jail in New York then goes to the Supreme Court. Having decided that the 14th Amendment, Section 3, is not self-executing, that a state cannot enforce it, the justices must now decide whether to uphold a district attorney under a state law to seize a convicted criminal under the extradition clause, which has always been pro forma. The court puts the case on its calendar several months in the future, in the spring of 2025. Its conservative members are at the moment on an extended Federalist Society retreat at a private luxury lodge in Wyoming paid for by Harlan Crow. And now Sidney Blumenthal sounds like an episode of The View. Or we click the heels of the Ruby Slippers. There's no place like home. We awake from a phantasmagorical dream in a bed surrounded by Aunt Em and Uncle Henry. Now, this scenario is ridiculous. It is absurd. Sidney Blumenthal sounds absolutely panicked. But there are parts of that actually could happen in a possible future. And all of that has elements of exactly what we're talking about. This idea that Congress is going to have the ability to simply declare Donald Trump ineligible if they can somehow get it to the floor and have enough uniparty votes to pass it. Now, of course, they would have enough uniparty votes to pass it, unless it is clear at the time that there is such an overwhelming majority of Americans who support Donald Trump and that they simply will not take a totally rigged outcome as they did in 2020. They are seeding plenty of narratives at different times in different outlets from different people to suggest that this is actually something being contemplated. Now, there's no way, of course, to know that any of this is going to come to pass, but it is worth considering, and it's especially worth considering in light of the fact that the Supreme Court has now stated plainly that if you are to remove a presidential candidate under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, you either need to have him convicted of insurrection or you need the Congress to enact legislation setting the standards and methods for enforcement. And that's what's now on the table. So we can celebrate the 9-0 decision. Obviously, Jenna Griswold in Colorado, a deranged communist, a fourth wave feminist, a George Soros Secretary of State, being thwarted by the Supreme Court is certain to please everyone, but I'm not sure this is the end of this issue. Jenna Griswold relayed her reaction on X, formerly Twitter, this morning, writing, "I am disappointed in the U.S. Supreme Court's decision stripping states of the authority to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment for federal candidates. Colorado should be able to bar oath-breaking insurrectionists from our ballot." Well, okay, commie. I hope you stick with that when you are the oath-breaking insurrectionist they're going after. Community Notes on X, formerly Twitter, responded under her tweet, writing, "In their unanimous decision, the Supreme Court noted, quote, the Constitution makes Congress rather than the states responsible for enforcing Section 3. So Community Notes is attempting to clarify here. The Supreme Court did not actually decide to strip states of the authority to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The states have never had that authority when it comes to federal office. But the community note didn't even respond to that. The community note is interesting because it is asserting the key aspect of this decision that relates exactly to what I'm suggesting in these possible future scenarios. This community note doesn't exactly respond to Griswold, but it does state that the Supreme Court put the power in the hands of the Congress to make this decision. Now, again, this is a good decision. The court decided correctly that the states should not be allowed to do this. And we can be happy about that, knowing that at least for now, Donald Trump remains on the ballot. He remains eligible to be president. Not that any of that was ever in doubt for me, and I'm guessing not in doubt for you either. But I'm a bit confused about some of the reaction from Con Inc. media and influencers, people who would have supported, for instance, Ron DeSantis or now Nikki Haley. These are people who have ignored the fact that our elections are stolen now for well over 3 years. As Donald Trump often says, the real insurrection was on November 3rd, 2020. Joe Biden, the fake president, is the beneficiary of that insurrection. But for the last 37 and a half months, all of these people pretended that Joe Biden was, in fact, a real legitimate president. And now they are all applauding that the Supreme Court has suggested that they actually will leave it to the voters to decide who's president and not some communist in Colorado. And despite being anti-Trump, this gives Con Inc. media and members of the uniparty right an opportunity to prove and fortify their conservative principles and bona fides. But I think there's a bit more going on here as well. Now, Democrats, for their part, are absolutely losing their minds over this. Keith Olbermann went crazy on Twitter, as always. He is suggesting that the court is totally illegitimate, as is often suggested by uniparty communists. And this gives Con Inc. an opportunity to play into the controlled opposition paradigm on that measure. They reassert the legitimacy of the court and the legitimacy of our institutions. And in both cases, the court is being judged relative to how much they are serving one party or another. The court is supposed to be impartial. And when a future decision comes around that is clearly biased against Donald Trump, Con Inc. media will be able to support that decision and maintain their air of objectivity that they always like to pretend they have. But they are not objective. That is an illusion. They will support things that Trump does when their interests are aligned with the interest of Donald Trump and MAGA. And they will then say that Trump didn't do it quite as well as he could have if he'd included the establishment more, if he had gone more toward what they wanted, his good decision or his good action, it would have been even better. But when the interests don't align, they can go against Donald Trump and say, we are just being objective. We're just calling balls and strikes. We're not the biased ones. We're not the partisan ones. That's that MAGA cult who judges everything by whether it helps or hurts Donald Trump. As always, a total inversion. And then the other factor to take into account, watching the reactions to the Supreme Court decision today, is that the excitement and the pride people are taking in this decision, their support for this decision, actually locks in the literal opinion in this decision into what people are supporting. If you are out there loudly praising this decision, then you are kind of praising everything encompassed within it. Or at least that's how it's going to be framed. Most people are just happy that Trump won 9-0 and that's it. End of story. Trump won 9-0. That's the real story. Well, once you commit yourself to that, then you are also committing yourself in their minds with how it will be framed in the future to agreeing that the Congress now has the power to disqualify Trump simply by voting to enact legislation that enforces Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, so that if and when it happens, the response will be, well, yes, everyone agreed that it was correct that the Congress could make this decision. So we can be happy about the decision today, but it's also possible that this Supreme Court decision closed one door and opened another. I will be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's happening!